Hello, book lovers! I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you are listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the PenFaulkner Foundation. PenFaulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the PenFaulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of really exciting books and authors coming your way this season. Next week, I talk to John Hickey about his brand new debut, Big Chief. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on the show, my guest is Colwill Brown, and we are discussing her brand new debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. We Pretty Pieces of Flesh takes us back to the 90s, to a gritty post-industrial town in Yorkshire, England, and introduces us to three girls, Rach, Shaz, and Kel. They've been best friends since they were 11, and the novel is a portrait of their friendship as they grow up. The book sucked me in because Colwill Brown does not paint a pink, pretty picture. She shows us the ugly truths, an unvarnished view. The novel is written in a Yorkshire dialect, and this voice is absolutely incredible. It took me a few pages to adapt, and once I was in, I was in. That voice created the atmosphere of a fever dream, which reflected the very childhood Colwill Brown portrayed. The voice mimicked the frenetic excitement, insecurities, and fear the teens all feel. Sexuality and class are huge themes in this book. In We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, Brown does not shy away from anything, including sexual violence. One of the three girls is raped, and she hides it for years. We are going to touch on this in the interview. And if you or someone you know have experienced sexual violence and need help, you can reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. The memory of violence weaves in and out of the book, just as the characters weave between past and present, always trying to find a place that is safe, where they are loved. The book shows us what it's really like to grow up as a girl without pinkwashing or flinching. Colwill, I can't wait to talk to you about your debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. Welcome to Check This Out.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Colwill, this book has been a long time coming. I heard you read excerpts back in, I think, maybe 2017, and it was brilliant back then, and it has only gotten better. And your voice is really the strength of the novel. It creates this fever dream feel. Can you kick us off by reading for us? Give us that voice.
Sure, yeah. I was just going to read the opening page. Victory. Remember when we thought Donny were whole world? Before we knew we were northern, when we seemed to be central? When we carved countries out at farmers' fields, biking through neck-high rapeseed, cutting tracks. Stalks flattened beneath us wheels, releasing sweet smell of honey and rot, pollen dusting us skin, wasp yellow. Bike chain clacking, thighs burning, daring each other to go non-handed. It were a state of mind non-handed. You had to just let go and believe. When Coop's chocolate concrete were a delicacy, when sex facts were currency, dead eyes were a language, when kicking littler kids off backseat at bus were a career, when romance were getting mashed on Smirnoff ice on summer nights like canals stretch of still brown water, lazing on grass in late evening light. So late, we stopped believing in creeping dusk. When it were cheeky tinnies guzzled beneath a bale tower that loomed like a ship's mast behind house rows, that was shaped like a sad man staring at his outstretched feet. Time we tried climbing to top. Stalks sticking in us bras and socks, and accidentally set all thing ablaze with flick of a half-smoked cig.
That voice is just magical. And I want to be clear that you read the audiobook, so we can listen to that voice for hours.
Yeah. Yes, if you really want to, yes, you can.
And I actually found it easier to read this book as an audiobook, to listen as an audiobook. I was pulled in. I wasn't as distracted by trying to figure it out because I could just fall into your voice and your tone. And really, it just took me away. And audiobooks are reading. That counts as reading.
Oh, completely. Yeah, no, it's just because it's me. That's why. So I'm saying if you have to listen to 12 hours of me, on your head be it.
what is this Yorkshire dialect that you're using? Can you introduce us to it?
Sure, yeah. So this is just the way that I spoke growing up. I was born and raised in Doncaster, where the book is set, which is in the county of South Yorkshire, in the wider county of Yorkshire, in the north of England. Yorkshire has a very strong identity. It's the largest county in England, and Yorkshire people tend to be very proud of where they're from, and the accent's very distinctive, but it doesn't feature very heavily in literary fiction. So and my town in particular, I've never seen represented. So that's where the dialect comes from. It's just simply the way that we spoke, and me trying to capture that somewhat poetically, I suppose.
But I think a lot of writers would have just confined that to the dialogue, and so just when their characters are speaking, but you have it in every single sentence. That's the entire voice throughout. So how did you make that decision to write that way?
In some ways, it wasn't a decision. It's just how the very first thing I wrote for the book, that's how it came out. And I just sort of went with it. I never tried to write it in standard English. It was the only thing that made sense to me because if you confine it to the dialogue, if you confine the dialect to the dialogue alone, what you're implying is that somebody who doesn't speak that way is the narrator. The narrator doesn't belong to the world somehow. So then the story isn't being told by the people who inhabit that world. It's being told by another. And that felt really wrong to me. I wanted the girls to tell their own story. It just would have been bizarre if this, standard English speaking person emerged to give us, to tell us what was going on. And then the dialect only happened in the conversation. The story wouldn't belong to the characters.
Did you get a lot of pushback from people along the way to write in standard English?
No. You'd think that I would, but no. And I wrote the book in America, and all of my readers were American, and they just the ones who got it, they were just like they felt that it was like music. A classmate of mine said it feels like I've discovered a music genre that I didn't know existed. So if you read it musically, it starts to make its own sense, and they felt that that was something that added rather than subtracted to the experience.
So this amazing debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, is written entirely in a Yorkshire dialect, and I've never seen a book like that before. Have you?
I've never seen a book written entirely in Yorkshire dialect. The only book that comes to mind, that's really kind of a famous sort of touchstone would be Train Spotting by Irvine Welsh, which is written in a Scottish dialect all the way through. So there was a precedent for me. I know that somebody had done like a whole book of phonetic spellings that were going to be really tricky for outsiders to read, but I don't think it's super common, and I certainly haven't seen it with Yorkshire.
I love that you brought up Train Spotting because I actually have described this book as Train Spotting in Yorkshire for girls.
Yeah, I mean, there's less heroin, let's be clear, but which is maybe a good thing, but not no heroin. Train Spotting is really exploring a group of people who are really on the edge and really on the outside of society and really, really struggling. My book is it's not quite that far onto the margins, but it is looking at people who are somewhere along the line dealing with poverty, drugs, etc. But that's not really kind of the main thrust of the book. But yeah, that's it's a good description though.
But I just want to stick with this voice for another few minutes because it really just drives the entire book, right? Like you said, it's musical, it's magical, and it creates this fever dream idea. And it made me feel like in this debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, like you poured your soul into the pages and it made it feel very personal. Is it personal for you?
It's funny that you should say that because I started working on this book in earnest when I went to my MFA program. And my advisor, Elizabeth McCracken, she read another book that I'd written that was the book that I had revised in the novel incubator program at Grub Street in Boston that I had worked really hard on for years, but it was set in America and all the characters were American. And Elizabeth read that novel. She said she would give me feedback on it. And her feedback was good novel, but are you sure that this is really where, the direction you want to go in? Because this new stuff you're doing, this Doncaster stuff, she was like, it feels like you're writing from your soul. And I was like, okay, forget that book. Let's just do the from the soul writing, because that's where you want to be, I think, as a writer, is you want to be writing something that's really, really vital to you. So it is incredibly personal in the sense that this is my town. This was the era I grew up in. These are the places that I hung out. These are the kinds of opportunities that were available to me, the kinds of problems and conflicts that were available to me. And the book began accidentally. I didn't sort of go into it this way, but the book began really as an inquiry about, like, what the hell happened back then, like what happened in my childhood that shaped me, which was especially strange thing to ask myself being so far away from home because, as you know, I started this book in Boston and then finished it in Texas. And it's a strange thing to be so disconnected from that universe and to be in what feels like a completely different planet sometimes, in the sort of the heart of Texas. So it was, yeah, I was trying to figure out how much influence all of those years, those childhood years and the teen years had on me and the way that I turned out.
And what did it come down to? What were you trying to capture about teenage life of girls in the 90s in Yorkshire?
Well, there's so many things I could say about that. One of them is it was an era when we didn't think that we needed feminism anymore, which is like pa- painfully funny now. Um, but we lived in this era when it was sort of, well, we've dealt with that, women are allowed to work now, so everything's fine. And it was really not cool to be a feminist. And I just didn't realize how much of our identities were really shaped around masculinity, like even as girls, to be cool was to be cool in a way that the lads were cool. Like we were quite laddish in a way. One of the editors that I spoke to when we were selling it in the UK referred to the kind of chavette culture. It was just a sort of the girl version of a chav, or the ladette culture. And that was a lot of what was going on at that time. It was like we were like drinking like the boys and like partying like the boys and like doing stupid things like the boys, rebelling like the boys. I didn't think of it that way or see it that way at the time, but I think there was a way in which we centralized laddishness as the ultimate marker of social status, and also as the ultimate way to gain approval. The less of a girl you were, in my world, the better.
The other thing that I really love about this book and this moment in time is you capture three girls in the 90s in your debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. And that is the last moment of childhood without cell phones, right? And so it is this golden era where they can be doing these stupid things and making terrible decisions, and there's no record of it anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they do creep in. I think by the time they're 13, I think Rach has a cell phone because she ends up getting prank called, which was I don't know if that still happens, but it was a big feature when we finally got mobile phones. Nobody ever had any credit on them in Britain. I don't know if they work differently in America, but everybody had a pay as you go. And nobody had any money. So it was like, oh, it was almost like a pager, it was almost like a beeper. But the two things that people would use the cell phones for when we did finally get them was playing the ringtones really loud on the back of the bus. The more offensively, irritating, the better. And prank calling each other. And that was it, really. Text messages were completely indecipherable because it was all numbers and single letters. And so it was technology was beginning to creep in, but it really wasn't there yet. So not only was there no record of anything, but it changed how you expected your day to go. If you were going to meet your mates down the shopping center on a Saturday, if they missed their bus, you just had to wait for an hour and a half and just hope that they showed up. But it meant that people were less flaky as well because they couldn't text last minute and go like, oh, SARS, I've changed my plans. So it was a different world. You had to remember where you were going. There was no Google Maps.
Do people ask you if this book, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, is about your own life?
No one has actually yet. I don't know if that's because they just assume that it is and it's not worth asking, or if it's because there are three protagonists rather than one. I've wondered. I think that question gets asked a lot of people who have like a primary protagonist who seems like they might be a little bit of a proxy for the writer. But yeah, nobody's ever asked me that.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Colwill Brown, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Colwill's brand new debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. So, Colwill, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh is centered on three girls, their friendship. I hesitate a little bit when I say friendship because they're a little bit of love hate. There's a little bit of foes in there, but they're mostly friends. Can you introduce us to these three characters?
Yes, sure. So they're a trio. There's Rach, Shaz, and Kel. Rach and Kel have been best friends since they were born, pretty much. They were raised on the same cul-de-sac. So they played out together all their lives. And then when they went up to big school, secondary school, which in Britain is where you got the age of 11, they met Shaz. And they both saw immediately idolized Shaz. She seemed very cool, very popular, very sure of herself. Like she knew everything already. She'd already been there, done that. And so they were both very kind of enamored with her. Shaz quietly, and we don't really understand this until we're in her perspective. She is fiery. She is cocky. She is a force of nature, but she's also very, very vulnerable, and she's got a lot to deal with. And so that big front is obscuring a lot of sort of tenderness inside. But she's really the kind of the firecracker of the group. Kel is the sort of quiet, amenable one. So she's the peacekeeper. She's always trying to make sure that the other two don't explode at each other. And there are the occasional explosions between Shaz and Rach. There's something between them that is something like a rivalry. Is also something like that, like you were saying, that border of love and hate. There's something really intense about their relationship that forces them kind of into frequent conflicts. But there's like a very deep affection there. Rach is the most well off of the trio. Her parents are still together. They're doing all right for money. They've just moved into a nice house. She sometimes feels on the edge because of that, because she's got a bit more than the others, and that makes her feel kind of weird and guilty. But she wishes she could be as free and charismatic as Shaz is, and she's quite nervous about her own social position and fitting in and being normal. And
So we have these three very distinct characters, these three girls, and you put in a very sort of quiet class distinction there, where Rachel's family is a little bit better off than the other two, whereas Shaz is often hungry or choosing between clothing and food. So why introduce that dynamic?
really great question. Thank you for asking that, because it was on purpose. This maybe isn't it's not something you would pick up as an American reader. You wouldn't have this context, but in Britain, I mean, I couldn't really sum up the British class system in any kind of succinct way, or really adequately explain the way that it interacts with identities like the Yorkshire identity, except to say that there exists traditionally this broad idea that the more northern you are, the more working class you are, right? And that's signified by your voice. So if you've got a northern accent, there's a traditional perception. I'm not saying that everybody sees it this way, or that it's not changing, but there was a traditional perception that Yorkshire voice signified you as a working class person. The North was the home of the Industrial Revolution, just to give you this sort of historical. So a lot of people, the cities there boomed with people who moved there to work in the mills and the factories and down the mines. And Doncaster was a mining town. So that's sort of partially where that class divide perception comes from. So it was important to me to demonstrate that people from the North, people from Yorkshire, people from Doncaster aren't a monolith, and that there's a lot of wouldn't even say stratifications, because I think it's more complicated than that. But class is just more complicated than we'd like to sort of make it out. And I just thought it would be really flat and inaccurate and pandering to those traditional assumptions if the girls we're all from the exact same class background. I wanted to show that those class pressures exist even in a working class town. You have those variations. Someone's got more than the other. Someone lives in a nicer part of town. How does that affect the social group? How does that affect how people feel about themselves, how they feel about other people? All of that stuff is going on in the microcosm of Doncaster.
Colwill, in your debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, your three main characters are three girls, Kel, Shaz, and Rach. And almost the entire time, I think they were just referred to with those nicknames, Kel, Shaz, and Rach. And I had this sense that they weren't really rooted in full names, that by using these short names, these nicknames, you almost were cutting them off from those roots, right, that could hold them down. Why only use their nicknames throughout the book?
Oh, I love that interpretation. That's not something that has occurred to me before, but I really like that interpretation. Um, the reason is because I feel like that's how a lot of people in my life appeared to me, especially back then. There'd be so many people that you'd know for years, and you'd know them as Dragon or Blue or something. And then, sort of 10 years in, you can like, I've got no idea what that dude's name is. People can be like your family and you don't know their second name. But the way that I got to know the three of them was the way that you would get to know a friend. And however long you know somebody, you don't ever know everything about them. And so, we can always be surprised by like, oh, I didn't know you had a sister, by your sort of best friend of 15 years. And so I was just really reflecting the way that I was getting to know them. I felt like if their second names came up, I'd find out what they were, but they didn't. Kel's and Rachel's did eventually. I had to invent second names for them, but with Shaz, it just never came up. And that's how it feels knowing people, especially from childhood or what have you. Like that guy has been named Cheesy since he was 7. And we're 27 now, and I don't know what he's called. That's just sort of how it went.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Colwill Brown, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. One of the things that I really, really loved about this book is the voice. Colwill has written this entire novel in a Yorkshire dialect. It is musical, it is magical, and it gives the feeling of a fever dream. And her characters, I think, are hyper aware of the fact that they have this dialect, especially when they go out into the world and they start learning how to code switch a little bit. And Colwill, I was wondering if you could read a passage about that so we can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Please forgive my American accent. Casey always told Kel same thing. Your accent's not that strong, but it's there. We have a guy come in whose accent's real strong, but yours is harder to spot. Cashiers told her this, like it were a compliment. They had no idea she had to whack it back on thick whenever she went home. In Yorkshire, losing your accent were unforgivable. It meant you were putting on airs, forgetting yoursen. Rach got a bit of a posh voice on after uni, which were bad. Shaz never forgave her, but nowhere near as bad as coming home with a Yankee twang. How come it were always some bloke swanning round Boston, accent intact, and hers had gone all wobbly? These famously unchangeable blokes, making everyone strain to understand them, while she did whatever she could to be easier to hear. Her co-workers would say it were gendered. Kel couldn't take those kinds of words back to Yorkshire either.
So there we go. The girls are very aware of their accent and how it's seen in the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the two moments of awareness that happen off page, if you like. That's when Rach goes to uni and when Cal moves to America. Now, for Rach, again, this is not a really big feature of the book. We only hear about her uni in stories that she tells or that Shaz tells. But as somebody who went to uni from Doncaster, I can tell you there the code switching is very much a class thing. I went to Leeds University in the same that Rachel did, which is in Yorkshire. It's a big city in Yorkshire. It's about an hour away from where I lived, where I grew up. And yet I appeared to be the only person with a Yorkshire accent on my course. You know, everybody else was from down south. A lot of people were from private school. A lot of people were from wealthy families. So I was this weird outsider in my own county, which was really bizarre. It was the first time I noticed my accent, I suppose. I remember being stood at the bus stop and a group of my friends were like, oh, you know, we all say bath, but you say bath. It's only you who says bath. And I was like, yeah, me and the rest of the county, mate. Like, what are you talking about? Like, it was really strange, but I was singled out. And I remember I also had a flatmate who was from Manchester, which is not in Yorkshire, but it's a big northern city. And she was the only other northerner I knew in my first year. And whenever she walked into the room, she'd say something really Manchester. You know, she'd really give it some with the accent. And all of the posh girls would be like, oh, you know, it was like this, like, they were like fantastically excited to be slumming it with us and to hearing these sounds that we were making. And I remember watching that and feeling really like sick and just being like, okay, I'm not going to be your like northern jester, you know, I don't want to do that. So that was my sort of rude awakening when I realized how accent was going to affect the way that I was perceived. But moving to America, the way that Kel did when it happened for Kel, I had this complete opposite situation in which nobody had any class references for my voice in America. It was just simply a British voice, and it was tremendously exciting, especially my first year in America. I was at a study abroad year in UMass Amherst. So it was a state school, and it was mostly kind of suburban mass kids who were there. So a lot of them had never met like anyone from somewhere else, certainly not a British person. So I had like a few British friends, and we would like roll up to a party, and everybody would be like, "The British are here!" You know, they were just so excited. And so that was a sort of an awareness of the power of voice and of accent in the completely opposite end of the spectrum. It actually gave me social power, and it gave me cachet, and it made me interesting and desirable and all kinds of things. So yeah, so very, very different experiences. A little bit of that is reflected in the book.
Yeah, and you give that to the characters. You let them explore this code switching or where they are because of their accent. And I think you really had me questioning how much accent signals and means, and how much everyone is code switching between how they use their accent or don't. If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Colwill Brown, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Colwill's brand new debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. This book is set in the late 90s, and it focuses on three girls who are growing up, coming of age together. They're best friends. They're trying to figure out how to be girls in Yorkshire, England, and they speak with this heavy dialect, which is amazing. But one of the big things that really is insidious throughout this book, as these are girls learning to grow up, is really violence against women. And it's mostly sexual, but there's also a physical violence. And Colwill, you write it very quietly for the most part. There are a couple of scenes where it's not, but this insidious violence is there throughout the book. And I was wondering if you could read for us to give us a sense of how you do that. The passage that I would love for you to read to us is a passage from Kel's time in America, and she was married to Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Alex still had a key. He'd promised not to use it, but in early days of their breakup, before his sadness had soured to anger, he'd also promised to sign papers she needed to get a permanent green card. Papers that were due in 3 weeks. A missed deadline would mean no more green card, no more America. Lately, he'd been cagey whenever she emailed, like he'd remembered power he had over her, decided to make her beg. She didn't understand why he'd insisted on keeping key, why he couldn't leave her to dilapidate in peace, without fear of intrusion. She were always tense, freezing whenever she heard a rustle in fire, a rattle that sounded like a key sliding into the lock, always waiting for him to burst back in.
There's a very quiet threat, quiet violence against women in that passage. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so again, um, Kel's marriage is something that doesn't make it onto the page much. By the time we catch up with her in America, the marriage is already over. So in that chapter, we get these glimpses through through recall, through memory. So we don't go into it a lot, but my sense is that this was a marriage in which I don't think Kel was ever physically abused. Like, I don't think she ever received, anything that we would typically associate with physical violence. But there was a sort of, I think, coercion going on, and a sort of attempt to control her through anger. The story that emerges as Kel tells us about gives us little insights into what happened between them. Is a story of a couple who really can't figure out sex at all. Kel's husband comes back from being deployed and they just can't get on the same page with sex. And one of the big reasons is whenever she doesn't want it, he gets really angry. And the more angry he gets, the less that she wants it. So it's this horrible cycle that they end up in, and they don't seem to be able to talk about it. And it just leads to a lot of things like I think at one point he says to her, you know, maybe there's just something wrong with you. Like, that's why you don't want to have sex with me. And we also get a hint that he might have been financially controlling. So there's a moment when she mentions they had a screaming row in a coffee shop because he wouldn't let her buy whipped cream, for 40 cents extra or whatever. And this all culminates in this very subtle, but nonetheless terrifying for Kel, implication that he might not help her with her green card. There's just this moment where he uses that as a way to try and make her have sex with him.
But what he does is he intimidates her by just having the key because he could come into the apartment at any moment, and she has no control over when he might come or what he might
Right.
do when he comes, and that's terrifying
Right.
to her.
The control of the space, it's symbolic of all of these other little forms of control that he enacted over their relationship, and it's a sort of a physical representation of the way that she feels that the house could be invaded at any moment, but she also feels like she could be ejected from America at any moment if this man changes his mind, basically.
So you have these instances in your debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. You have these instances of quiet violence and threat of Kel's husband holding this key and refusing to give it back. But then you have very loud violence against women. Early on in the book, we find out that Shaz was raped. And it's a very upsetting, very disturbing scene. But I wanted to ask you about it nonetheless, because I think it really is sort of weaves throughout the book back and forth as this secret that is holding all three girls back in a way. So can you talk about what that rape, that moment for Shaz, what that does for the trajectory of the three girls?
Yeah, the way that we find out about Shaz's assault is through this chapter that's very short, but is very kind of cyclical. She's going round and round and round in a loop, trying to move on with her life and not think about this and get this night that where this horrible thing happened to her out of her head and just leave it behind. But she can't. It just keeps coming back and back and back. So she's stuck in a loop into her adulthood where holding this in, bottling it up, not talking about it to anybody really starts to become untenable. And she's starting to not be able to cope anymore with holding this secret in. But it weaves through the relationship with the girls because it has major implications for another girl in the group for her life as well. And so there's this big question that Shaz has to answer, which is, am I going to tell my best friend that somebody that she admires and loves and has married is actually a rapist? And so it has it's this sort of time delayed bomb in many ways because it just has the power to destroy their intimacy and their closeness. And I think I didn't set it out to write a book about that. It just sort of happened organically in the writing, but it feels true. I think that we sometimes think about sexual assault as something that affects the victim only, but it's often not the case. It's often a lot more complicated than that, and the consequences are a lot more far-reaching. So I think I'm glad I found a way to explore that in the book, because I do think that that is something we don't always think about.
And I appreciated that you brought in that the men that assaulted her were people that she knew and people who stayed in her life, because that is often the case for women. And you didn't shy away from that. Why did you make that choice?
I think I don't have the statistics to hand, but I think you're actually, as a woman, more likely to be assaulted by somebody that you know. So just coming from a craft perspective, when we talk about verisimilitude, it was just the most plausible thing that could have happened. And I think we sometimes. I think we're sometimes laboring under the delusion that it's otherwise. We have a lot of books and shows about like a sort of a predator who just comes out of nowhere to murder and rape, and that obviously also sometimes happens, but more often than not it's close to home, and more often than not people don't get the big official justice closure that they need and deserve. Again, I don't have the statistics to hand, but we know that a huge amount of rapists are never brought to trial. We know that a lot of people never get formal justice in that way. And so if that's somebody that if you've been assaulted by somebody you know and you don't have access to formal justice for one reason or another, you're going to have to deal with that person being in your life, and you're going to have to live that way and find a way to live with that. So again, it just felt like the most plausible thing that could have happened.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Colwill Brown, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. Sticking with the three girls in your book, Shaz, Kels, and Rach, they are all exploring their sexuality. They're growing up. They are spending a lot of time being sexual, learning to be sexual. But you didn't give us any pink washed, Romeo, Juliet, big romance. You gave us much more, I'm going to say, grittier, no true love story in this book. Why did you decide to do that?
I think I didn't want romantic love to take center stage. I decided quite early on that I did want the book to be about the girls and to be about friendship. The very first scene that I wrote was the scene that now occurs in the middle of the book, where Kel is waiting for Ando, this boy she's obsessed with, to show up. They're sort of bunking off school and they're going to go and have sex behind the bushes. And so that's where it kind of started. And I liked that scene, and Ando, he's a reoccurring character in the book, and he's an important part of Kel's history. But when I was sort of drafting this out and trying to figure out who Kel was, she sat outside the tippy waiting, and she's having a fag, and she's sort of getting nervous about Ando. How you do when you do like a very brief character sketch when you're just very first getting to know somebody on the page. And so I was like, well, she probably has mates. All right, let's give them a name, Shaz and Kel. Well, they'll be in class. They're not here right now, they'll be in class. And when I finished that scene, I was like, this is good, but I don't want my own book to not pass the Bechdel test. I was like, from the beginning, I was like, this is like 20, I think 15. I think we
What is
were
that
talking
test? Can you just remind us?
the Bechdel test. It was the comedian Alison Bechdel, I believe, came up with this. It was for films, but came up with this test. A film would pass the Bechdel test if there was at least one scene where there were no men in it and at least two women were talking, and they were not talking about men. And surprisingly few things that come out of Hollywood would pass that test. So that was what I didn't want the book to be, a female protagonist, but but from the beginning, I wanted it to be about the girls.
Also, I think it's it's more realistic in that sense, because how many teenagers actually have grand romance in their life? It's much more of a what am I doing moment.
Yeah, for sure. I did worry a little bit that I'd gone a little bit too far the other way. Like I was like, oh my God, are all the men in this book terrible? And I didn't want to write a book that was that way either, that only represented men in this really negative way. But you do, like, as teenagers, you are figuring it out. So those relationships can really be a bit of a mess, because nobody knows what they're doing.
When I put your debut novel down, the first question that I was asking myself was, is there any forgiveness in this novel? And what does that mean?
Ooh, good question. Yes, I think there is. I don't know if there's a lot. Maybe there's just a lot of people who are very upset with each other. I think that Rach and Shaz find a way to forgive each other, at least for some of it, at the end. I think that just the fact that they can talk and joke with each other and that they are entertaining, trying to keep the friendship together. I think that's a sort of form of forgiveness. I don't know. I feel like at the end of the book, Shao spends a lot of the book like angry, but I think at the end of the book, she's in a different place in her life, and I think that she starts to realize that the person she was angry at maybe had their own problems, and I think that was the same for Rach as well. Like this person who she thought had everything because she was so beautiful and so cocky and so sure of herself, maybe she didn't actually. So I think as adults, Rach and Shaz, they begin to have a different perspective on their childhood, and all of that resentment that they had in their childhood, I think some of that begins to dissipate as they become adults.
How do you want your readers to talk about this book? What do you want the frame to be when they approach conversations about this book? We Pretty Pieces of Flesh.
I think talking about female friendship is one of the more productive ways to look at it, and one of the more, I think, slightly more universal themes, or if not universal, um, one of the themes that reaches beyond the time and the place. Um, and I think that so that's a big way into the book. I think it's just the complexity and the nuance of female friendships, and especially of young female friendships, how intense they could be. And we don't see a ton of that, I think. Deep exploration into what it means to be a teenager. And we sort of look back on teenagers and go like, oh, weren't they ridiculous? They had all those emotions and everything seemed so vital and immediate and life or death, and it wasn't. But we all lived that. We lived those feelings, and those feelings were real when we were inside of them. So that's another part of it as well, the intensity of that period of time in your life. And I think we shouldn't belittle it. It had a huge impact on us, and it shaped us in so many ways. So that's another piece of the book that I think is worth thinking about.
What I loved about the way you approached these friendships between these three girls in this novel, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh, is that you have these three girls as best friends, but you also show that they're so insecure about the friendship. Right. So, don't tell Rach, or I know it was Shaz who did that. You give us the internal monologue, sometimes the external, but on the outside, I think to the gym teacher, for example, they look like three besties that you could never separate. But you give us behind that, right, behind the net with the gym teacher, because there's a scene, right, maybe two, where you show us that it's really not that easygoing. And I liked that because I think that's true for I think that's a universal truth for friendship, that no friendship is that easygoing.
Definitely. Yeah. And I said this somewhere else, but I think I've been in a few different trios throughout my life, and I think that there is a very palpable instability in a trio, because more often than not, we're all friends and we're all best friends, and that's what we've agreed on. But there's usually a cut two of the trio are like actually growing closer and sort of almost conspiring to oust the other one. So, but that's always changing as well. So the allegiances would switch between, and in other friendship groups I've been in that have been bigger, we're all close friends, but there are always these other intimacies that are happening within the friendship group, and there are complex social politics going on. It can't just be me, and I'm like really fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by the vicissitudes of all of that, and it is tense and it is full of drama, but I think part of that is because drama is really stimulating and exciting. So I think especially when you're young, it feels like an inherent part of having a friendship is like having someone to gossip about. And did you hear what so and so said? And oh well, it's the big drama girls because she's said this about you. And
You give that to all three of the characters. They have all of that drama. Like, you really, as I've said again and again, you don't pink wash this book. This is what it's like to be a teenage girl in a group of three. And it's not always easygoing. And I thought that was so real and so raw. And I appreciated that you showed us that on the page.
thank you.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Colwill Brown, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Colwill's brand new debut, We Pretty Pieces of Flesh. This book is beautiful. It is raw. It is written in a way like no other book I've ever read. It is in a Yorkshire dialect that is musical and magical, and it weaves in and out of the past and present and focuses on three girls and their friendship. I wanted to ask you, Colwill, where did this book start for you?
On Boston Common on a lunch break.
That's a great answer.
I was working at Grub Street Creative Writing Centre in downtown Boston, and our officers used to, they don't now, but they used to look onto the Common. And a colleague and I decided to go down there on a lunch break and just take on notebooks, get a bit of writing done. I had been thinking for a while, like I said, I'd been working on this book that was set in America, and I've been thinking for a while, like, what are you doing? Like, why? It was set in New Orleans, and come on, I'm uniquely unqualified to write a book set in New Orleans. So I was like, you are uniquely qualified to write a book about Doncaster. Like, why not at least try? And I didn't have any ambition beyond that. I just wanted to see if it was even possible to do, because there were no precedents and no one had ever done it. And I thought, well, maybe no one's ever tried it because it's not worth it. I don't know. So I sat down on Boston Common and I just thought, whatever comes out will come out. And we'll see, we'll take it from there. And what came out was Kel waiting for Ando outside the chip shop.
Colwell, I understand that you suffer from a debilitating neurological disease. How has that affected your writing? Can you tell us about that? Do you mind going personal with us?
Yeah, thank you for asking, Rachel. The disease itself is chronically, systemically underfunded and neglected. So I find it really important to talk about when I can. So thank you for giving me the platform to do so. I actually started getting significantly sick around the time I started writing this book. So I've become progressively sicker as the book has. So maybe the book has sucked my life force. I don't know. I don't know why those two things have a parallel trajectory, but maybe it is connected really, because the most profound symptom of ME/CFS, which is my disease, is persistent, debilitating fatigue. And novels are, as you know, Rachel, absolute marathons. They are truly, especially your first novel, feats of determination and wild belief with it's just faith that this is going to go somewhere. It's hours and hours and years out on the side of whatever you're doing to make money. So it's incredibly difficult to write a novel, but it's inexpressibly difficult to write one with the kind of fatigue that I live with every day. So that has been the main impact, is just physically, how am I going to do this? And the other impact is that I realized at a certain point that this is the thing that I'm quite good at, and the thing that I could have a chance at contributing to the public discourse in a relatively oblique way through fiction. It's not going to massively move the needle in the direction that we need that needle to move, which is towards more understanding, more recognition, more education for clinicians, more treatment, less stigma. But hopefully it will contribute to that conversation in some way. So I just got to a point where I realized I have to write about it one way or another. So you'll see in this book, it does make an appearance later on, and for no good plot reason. It's it's not defendable on a craft level. I just felt I needed to represent a very invisible population in some way or another.
Colwill Brown, thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out.
Thank you so much for having me, Rach. It was a blast.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the PEN-Faulkner Foundation. PEN-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the PEN-Faulkner Award for Fiction. I'll be back next week with John Hickey. We'll be talking about his debut novel, Big Chief. Make sure to check this out. And if you or someone you know have experienced sexual violence and need help, you can reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. Our producer is NHPR's Jessica Hunt. PEN-Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. This show is sponsored by CNS Wholesale Grocers family of companies. the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all the books you hear about here and love. Thanks for listening. See you next time.